welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon, and today we're going to be reading some more of Emily of New Moon, so let's just jump on into it. We're going to start with chapter 12, The Tansy Patch. Emily and Elise had a splendid fortnight of fun before their first fight. It was really quite a terrible fight, arising out of a simple argument as to whether they would or would not have a parlor in the playhouse they were building in Lofty John's Bush. Emily wanted a parlor and Elise didn't. Elise lost her temper at once and went into a true Burnley tantrum. She was very fluent in her rages, and the volley of abusive dictionary words which she hurled at Emily would have staggered most of the Blairwater girls. But Emily was too much at home with words to be floored so easily. She grew angry too, but in the cool, dignified Murray way which was more exasperating than violence. When Elise had to pause for breath in her diatribes, Emily, sitting on a big stone with her knees crossed, her eyes black and her cheeks crimson, interjected little sarcastic retorts that infuriated Elise further still. Elise was crimson too, and her eyes were pools of scintillating tawny fire. They were both so pretty in their fury that it was almost a pity they couldn't have been angry all the time. "You needn't suppose, you little puling, sniveling shit, that you are going to boss me just because you live at New Moon," shrieked Elise, as an ultimatum, stamping her foot. "I'm not going to boss you. I'm not going to associate with you ever again," retorted Emily. "I'm glad to be rid of you, you proud, stuck-up, conceited, top-lofty bibbit," cried Elise. "Never you speak to me again, and don't you go about Blairwater saying things about me either." Well, this was unbearable to a girl who never said things about her friends or one's friends. "I'm not going to say things about you," said Emily deliberately. "I'm just going to think them." This was far more aggravating than speech, and Emily knew it. Elise was driven quite frantic by it. Who knew what unearthly things Emily might be thinking about her at any time? Elise had already discovered what a fertile invention Emily had. "Do you suppose I care what you think, you insignificant serpent? Why, you haven't any sense." "I've got something that's far better," said Emily, with a maddening superior smile. "Something that you can never have, Elise." Elise doubled her fists as if she would like to demolish Emily by physical force. "If I couldn't write better poetry than you, I'd be so mad." "I'll lend you a dime," said Emily. Elise glared at her, vanquished. "You go to the devil," she said. Emily got up and went, not to the devil, but back to New Moon. Elise relieved her feelings by knocking the boards of their china closet down and kicking their moss gardens to pieces, and departed also. Emily felt exceedingly badly. Here was another friendship destroyed. A friendship, too, that had been very delightful and satisfying. Elise had been a splendid chum, there was no doubt about that. After Emily had cooled down, she went to the dormer window and cried. "Wretched me," she sobbed dramatically but very sincerely. Yet the bitterness of her break with Rhoda was not present. This quarrel was fair and open and above board. She had not been stabbed in the back. But of course she and Elise could never be chums again. You couldn't be chums with a person who called you a chit and a bibbit and a serpent and told you to go to the devil. The thing was impossible, and besides, Elise could never forgive her, for Emily was honest enough to admit to herself that she had been very aggravating too. Yet when Emily went to the playhouse next morning, bent on retrieving her share of broken dishes and boards, there was Elise, skipping around, hard at work with all the shelves back in place, the moss garden remade, and a beautiful parlor laid out and connected with the living room by a spruce arch. "Hello, you, here's your parlor, and I hope you'll be satisfied now," she said. "What's kept you so long? I thought you weren't coming." This rather posed Emily after her tragic night, wherein she had buried her second friendship and wept over its grave. She wasn't prepared for so speedy a resurrection. As far as Elise was concerned, it seemed as if no quarrel had ever taken place. "Why, that was yesterday," she said in amazement when Emily rather descantily referred to it. Yesterday and today were two entirely different things in Elise's philosophy. Emily accepted it, and she found she had to. Elise, it transpired, could no more help flying into tantrums now and then than she could help being jolly and affectionate between them. What amazed Emily, in whom things were bound to rankle for a time, was the way in which Elise appeared to forget a quarrel the moment it was over. To be called a serpent and a crocodile one minute and hugged and darlinged the next was somewhat disconcerting, until time and experience took the edge off it. "Aren't I nice enough between times to make up for it?" demanded Elise. "Dot Payne never flies into tempers, but would you like her for a chum?" "No, she's too stupid," admitted Emily. "And Rhoda Smart is never out of temper, but you got enough of her. Do you think I'd ever treat you like that?" Elise asked. No, Emily had no doubt on this point. Whatever Elise was or was not, she was loyal and true. And certainly Rhoda Starr and Dot Payne compared to Elise were as moonlight to sunlight and water to wine. Or would have been if Emily had yet known anything more of her Tennyson than the bugle song. "You can't have everything," said Elise. "I've got Dad's temper, and that's all there is to it. Wait till you see him in one of his rages." Emily had not seen this so far. She had often been down in the Burnleys' house, but on the few occasions when Dr. Burnley had been home, he had ignored her save for a curt nod. He was a busy man, for whatever his shortcomings were, his skill was unquestioned, and the bounds of his practice expanded far. By the sickbed, he was as gentle and sympathetic as he was brisk and sarcastic away from it. As long as you were ill, there was nothing Dr. Burnley would not do for you. Once you were well, he had no further use for you. He had been absorbed all through July trying to save Teddy Kent's life up at the Tansy patch. Teddy was out of danger now and able to be up, but his improvement was not speedy enough to satisfy Dr. Burnley. One day he held up Emily and Elise, who were heading through the lawn to the pond, with fishing hooks and a can of fat, abominable worms. The latter manipulated solely by Elise and ordered them to betake themselves up to the Tansy patch and play with Teddy Kent. "He's lonesome and moping. Go and cheer him up," said the doctor. Elise was rather loath to go. She liked Teddy, but it seemed she did not like his mother. Emily was secretly not adverse. She had seen Teddy Kent but once at Sunday school the day before he was taken ill, and she had liked his looks. It had seemed that he liked hers too, for she caught him staring shyly at her over the interviewing pews several times. He was very handsome. She liked his thick, dark brown hair and his black, brown, blue eyes, and for the first time it occurred to her that it might be rather nice to have a boy playmate, too. Not a beau, of course. Emily hated the school jargon that called a boy your beau. If he happened to give you a pencil or an apple and picked you out frequently for his partner in the games. "Teddy's nice, but his mother is not," Elise told her on the way to the Tansy patch. "She never goes out anywhere, not even to church, but I guess it's because of the scar on her face." They're not Blairwater people. They've only been living at the Tansy patch since last fall. They're poor and proud, and not many people visit them, but Teddy's awfully nice, so if his mother gives us some black looks, we needn't mind. Mrs. Kent gave them no such looks, though her reception was rather distant. Perhaps she too had received some orders from the doctor. She was a tiny creature with enormous masses of dull, soft, silky fawn hair and dark, mournful eyes, and a broad scar running slantwise across her pale face. Without the scar, she must have been very pretty, and she had a voice as soft and uncertain as the wind in the tansy. Emily, with her instinctive faculty of seizing up people she met, felt that Mrs. Kent was not a happy woman. The Tansy patch was east of the disappointed house, between the Blairwater and the sand dunes. Most people considered it a bare, lonely, neglected place, but Emily thought it was fascinating. The little clapboarded house topped a small hill over which tansy grew in a hard, flaunting, aromatic luxuriance. Rising steeply and abruptly from a main road, a staggering rail fence almost smothered in wild rose bushes bounded the domain, and a sagging, ill-used little gate gave ingress from the road. Stones were let into the side of the hill for steps up to the front door. Behind the house was a tumble-down little barn, and a field of flowering buckwheat, creamy green, sloping down to the Blairwater. In front was a crazy veranda around which a brilliant band of red poppies held up their enchanted cups. Teddy was unfeelingly glad to see them, and they had a happy afternoon together. There was some color in Teddy's clear olive skin when it ended, and his dark blue eyes were brighter. Mrs. Kent took in these signs greedily and asked the girls to come back with an eagerness that was not yet cordiality. But they had found the Tansy Patch a charming place and were glad to go again. For the rest of the vacation, there was hardly a day when they didn't go up to it. Preferably in the long, smoky, delicious August evenings when the white moths sailed over the tansy plantation, and the golden twilight faded into dusk and purple over the green slopes. Beyond, the fireflies lighted their goblin torches by the pond. Sometimes they played games in the Tansy Patch when Teddy and Emily somehow generally found themselves on the same side, and they had no more than a match for agile, quick-witted Elise. Sometimes Teddy took them to the barn loft and showed them his little collection of drawings. Both girls thought them very wonderful without knowing in the least how wonderful they really were. It seemed like magic to see Teddy take a pencil and a bit of paper, with a few quick strokes of his slim brown fingers bring out a sketch of Elise or Emily or Smoke or Buttercup that looked ready to speak or meow. Smoke and Buttercup were the Tansy Patch cats. Buttercup was a chubby, yellow, delightful creature, hardly out of kittenhood. Smoke was a big Maltese with an aristocrat from the tip of his nose to the tip of his tail. There was no doubt whatever that he belonged to the cat caste of Vere de Vere. He had emerald eyes and a coat of plush. Emily thought all the pleasure hours spent at the Tansy Patch, the pleasantest were those. When tired with play, they all three sat on the crazy veranda steps in the mystery and enchantment of the borderland between light and dark, when the little clump of spruce behind the barn looked like beautiful, dark, phantom trees. The clouds of the west faded into gray, and a great round yellow moon rose over the fields to be reflected brokenly in the pond, where the Wind Woman was making wonderful woven lights and shadows. Mrs. Kent never joined them, though Emily had a creepy conviction that she was watching them stealthily from behind the kitchen blind. Teddy and Elise sang school ditties, and Elise recited, and Emily told stories, or they just sat in happy silence, each anchored in some secret port of dreams, while the cats chased each other madly over the hill and through the tansy, tearing round and round the house like possessed creatures. They would spring up at the children with sudden pounces, and spring as suddenly away. Their eyes gleamed like jewels, their tails swayed like plums, and they were palpitating with nervous, stealthy life. "Oh, isn't it good to be alive like this?" Emily said once. "Wouldn't it be dreadful if one had never lived?" Still, existence was not wholly unclouded. Aunt Elizabeth took care of that. Aunt Elizabeth only permitted the visits to the Tansy Patch under protest, and because Dr. Burnley had ordered them. "Aunt Elizabeth does not approve of Teddy," Emily wrote in one of her letters to her father, which were steadily multiplying on the old garter sofa shelf. The first time I asked her if I might go and play with Teddy, she looked at me severely and said, "Who is this Teddy person?" "We do not know anything about these Kents. Remember, Emily, the Murrays do not associate with everyone." I said, "I'm a Star, I'm not a Murray. You said so yourself." "Dear father, I don't mean to be so impertinent, but Aunt Elizabeth said I was and would not speak to me the rest of the day. She seemed to think that was very bad punishment, but I didn't mind it much. Only, it is rather unpleasant to have your own family preserve a disdainful silence towards you. But since then, she lets me go to the Tansy Patch because Dr. Burnley came and told her to. Dr. Burnley has a strange influence over Aunt Elizabeth. I don't understand it. Rhoda said once that Aunt Elizabeth hoped Dr. Burnley and Aunt Laura would make a match of it, which you know means get married. But that's not so. Mrs. Thomas Anderson was here one afternoon to tea. Mrs. Thomas Anderson is a big woman, and her grandmother was a Murray, and there's nothing else to say about her. She asked Aunt Elizabeth if she thought Dr. Burnley would marry again, and Aunt Elizabeth said no, he would not, and she did not think it right for people to marry a second time. Mrs. Anderson said sometimes I have thought he would take Laura. Aunt Elizabeth just swept her a haughty glance. There was no use in denying it. There are times when I'm very proud of Aunt Elizabeth, even if I do not like her. Teddy's a very nice boy, Father. I think you'd approve of him. Should there be two P's in approve? Anyway, he can make splendid pictures, and he's going to be a famous artist someday. And then he's going to paint my portrait. He keeps his pictures in the barn loft because his mother doesn't like to see them. He can whistle just like a bird. The Tansy Patch is a very quaint place, especially at night. I love the twilight there. We always have such fun in the twilight. The Wind Woman makes herself small in the Tansy, just like a tiny, tiny fairy. And the cats are so strange and creepy and delightful. They belong to Mrs. Kent, and Teddy's afraid to pet them, much for fear she'll drown them. She drowned a kitten once because she thought he liked it better than her. But he didn't, because Teddy is very much attached to his mother. He washes the dishes for her and helps her in the housework. Elise says the boys in school call him a sissy for that, but I think it's noble and manly of him. Teddy wishes she would let him have a dog, but she won't. I thought Aunt Elizabeth was tyrannical. But Mrs. Kent is far worse in some ways. But she loves Teddy, and Aunt Elizabeth does not love me. But Mrs. Kent doesn't like me or Elise. She never says so, but we feel it. She never asks us to stay for tea, and we've always been so polite to her. I believe she's jealous of us because Teddy likes us. Teddy gave me the sweetest picture of the Blair water. He had painted on a big white shell. But he said I mustn't let his mother know about it because she would cry. Mrs. Kent is a very mysterious person, but not too close. Her eyes always look hungry, though she has plenty to eat. She never goes anywhere because she has a scar on her face where she was burned with a lamp exploding. It made my blood run cold. Dear Father, how thankful I am that Aunt Elizabeth only burns candles. Some of the Murray traditions are very sensible. Mrs. Kent is very religious. What she calls religious, anyway. She prays even in the middle of the day. Teddy says that before he was born into this world, he lived in another one where there were two suns, one red and one blue. The days were red and the nights were blue. I don't know where he got the idea, but it sounds attractive to me. He says the brooks run honey instead of water there. But what do you think when you were thirsty, I said. What did you drink when you were thirsty, I said. Oh, we were never thirsty there, but I think I would like to be thirsty because then cold water tastes so good. I would like to live in the moon. It must be such a nice silvery place. Elise says Teddy ought to like her best because there's more fun in her than in me, but that's not true. There's just as much fun in me when my conscience doesn't bother me. I guess Elise wants Teddy to like her best, but she's not a jealous girl. I'm glad to say that Aunt Elizabeth and Aunt Laura both approve of my friendship with Elise. It's so seldom they approve of the same thing. I'm getting used to fighting with Elise now and don't mind it much. Besides, I can fight pretty well myself when my blood is up. We fight about once a week, but we make up right away, and Elise says things would be dull if there was never a row. I'd like it better without rows, but you can never tell that what will make Elise mad. She never gets mad twice over the same thing. She calls me dreadful names. Yesterday she called me a lousy lizard and a toothless viper, but somehow I don't mind it much because I knew I wasn't lousy or toothless, and she knew it too. I don't call names because that's unladylike, but I smile, and that makes Elise far madder than if I had scowled and stamped as she does. So that's why I do it. Aunt Laura says I must be careful not to pick up the words Elise uses and try to set her a good example because the poor child has no one to look after her properly. I wish I could use some of her words because they are so striking. She gets them from her father. I think my aunts are too peculiar. One night, when the Reverend Mr. Dare was here to tea, I used the word bull in my conversation. I said Elise and I were afraid to go through Mr. James Lee's pasture, where the old well was, because he had a cross bull there. After Mr. Dare had gone, Aunt Elizabeth gave me an awful scolding and told me I was never to use that word again. But she had been talking of tigers at tea in connection with missionaries, and I can't understand why it's more disgraceful to talk about bulls than tigers. Of course, bulls are ferocious animals, but so are tigers. But Aunt Elizabeth says I'm always disgracing them when they have company. When Mrs. Lockwood was here from Shrewsbury last week, they were talking about Mr. Foster Beck. Mrs. Fosterbeck, who is a bride, and I said Dr. Burnley thought she was devilishly pretty. Aunt Elizabeth said, Emily, in that awful tone. She was pale with wrath. Dr. Burnley said it, I cried. I'm only knowing. And Dr. Burnley did say it the day I stayed to dinner with Elise, and Dr. Jameson was there from Shrewsbury. I saw Dr. Burnley in one of his rages that afternoon over something Mrs. Sims had done in his office. It was a gruesome sight. His big yellow eyes blazed, and he tore about, and he kicked over a chair, and he threw a mat at the wall, and fired a vase out the window, and said terrible things. I sat on the sofa and stared at him like one fascinated. It was so interesting. I was sorry when he cooled down when he did, because he's like Elise and never stays mad long. He never gets mad at Elise, though. Elise says she wishes he would. It'd be better than being taken no notice of. She is as much of an orphan as I am, poor child. Last Sunday she went to church with her old faded blue dress on. There was a tear right in front of it. Aunt Laura wept when she came home and then spoke to Mrs. Sims about it because she did not dare speak to Dr. Burnley. Mrs. Sims was cross and said it was not her place to look after Elise's clothes, but she said she had got Dr. Burnley to get Elise a nice sprigged muslin dress, and Elise had got egg stain on it. And when Mrs. Sims scolded her for being so careless, Elise flew into a rage and went upstairs and tore the dress to pieces. And Mrs. Sims said she wasn't going to bother her head again about a child like that, and that there was nothing for her to wear but her old blue. But Mrs. Sims didn't know it was tore. So I sneaked Elise's dress over to New Moon, and Aunt Laura mended it neatly and hid the tear with a pocket. Elise said she tore up her muslin dress one of the days she didn't believe in God and didn't care what she did. Elise found a mouse in her bed one night, and she just shook it and jumped in. Oh, how brave. I would never be as brave as that. It's not true that Dr. Burnley never smiles. I've seen him do it, but not often. He just smiles with his lips but not his eyes, and it makes me feel uncomfortable. Mostly he laughs in a horrid sarcastic way like Jimmy Jolly's uncle. We had barley soup for dinner that day, very watery. Aunt Laura is giving me 5 cents a week for washing the dishes. I can only spend 1 cent of it, and the other 4 have to be put in the toad bank in the sitting room on the mantel. The toad is made of brass and sits on top of the bank, and you put the cents in its mouth one at a time. He swallows them and they drop into the bank. It's very fascinating. I should not write fascinating again because you told me I must not use the same word too often. But I can't think of any other that describes my feelings so well. The toad bank is Aunt Laura's, but she said I could use it. I just hugged her. Of course I never hug Aunt Elizabeth. She's too rigid and bony, and she does not approve of Aunt Laura paying me for washing dishes. I tremble to think what she would say if she knew Cousin Jimmy gave me a whole $1 on the sly last week. I wish he had not given me so much. It worries me. It's an awful responsibility. It'll be so difficult to spend it wisely. Also, without Aunt Elizabeth finding out about it. I hope I shall never have $1 million. I am sure it would crush me utterly. I keep my dollar hid on the shelf with my letters, and I put it in an old envelope and wrote on it, Cousin Jimmy Murray gave me this, so that if I died suddenly and Aunt Elizabeth found it, she would know I came by it honestly. Now that the days are getting cool, Aunt Elizabeth makes me wear my thick flannel petticoat. I hate it. It makes me so bunchy, but Aunt Elizabeth says I must wear it because you died of consumption. I wish clothes could be both graceful and healthy. I read the story of Red Riding Hood today. I think the wolf was the most interesting character in it. Red Riding Hood was a stupid little thing, so easily fooled. I wrote 2 poems yesterday. One was short and entitled Lines Addressed to a Blue-Eyed Grass Flower Gathered in the Old Orchard. And here it is. Sweet little flower, thy modest face is ever lifted towards the sky, and a reflection of its face is caught within thine own blue eyes. The meadow queens are tall and fair, the columbines are lovely too, but the poor talent I possess shall laurel thee my flowers of blue. The other poem was long, and I wrote it on a letter bill. It's called The Monarch of the Forest. The monarch is the big birch in Lofty John's bush. I love the bush so much it hurts. Do you understand that kind of hurting? Elise likes it too, and we play there most of the time when we're not at the Tansy patch. We have 3 paths in it. We call them the Today Road, the Yesterday Road, and the Tomorrow Road. The Today Road is by the brook, and we call it that because it's lovely now. The Yesterday Road is out in the stumps where Lofty John cut some trees down, and we call it that because it used to be so lovely. The Tomorrow Road is just a tiny path in the maple clearing, and we call it that because it's going to be lovely someday when the maples grow bigger. But oh, Father dear, I haven't forgotten the dear old trees down home. I always think of them after I go to bed, but I'm happy here. It isn't wrong to be happy, is it, Father? Aunt Elizabeth says I got over being homesick very quick, but I'm often homesick. Inside. I've got awakened with Lofty John. I've got acquainted with Lofty John. Elise is a great friend of his and often goes there to watch him, working in his carpenter shop. He says he has made enough ladders to get to heaven without the priest, but that's just a joke. He's really very devout Catholic, and he goes to the chapel at White Cross every Sunday. I go with Elise, though perhaps I ought not to, when he is an enemy of my family. He's very stately and refined, so civil to me, but I don't always like him. When I ask him a serious question, he always winks over my head when he answers. That is insulting. Of course, I never ask any questions on religious subjects, but Elise does. She likes him, but she says he would burn us all at the stake if he had the power. She asked him right out if he wouldn't, and he winked at me and said, "Oh, we wouldn't burn nice pretty girls like you. We would only burn all the old ugly ones." That was a frivolous reply. Mrs. Lofty John is a nice woman and not at all proud. She looks just like a little rosy wrinkled apple. On rainy days, we play at Elise's. We can slide down the banisters and do what we like. Nobody cares. Only when the doctor is home, we have to be quiet because he can't bear any noise in the house except what he makes himself. The roof is flat and we can't get out on it through a door in the garret ceiling. It's very exciting to be up on the roof of a house. We had a yelling contest there the other night to see which could yell the loudest. To my surprise, I found it was me. You never can tell what you can do till you try. But too many people heard us, and Aunt Elizabeth was very angry. She asked me what made me do such a thing. That's an awkward question, because often I can't tell what makes me do things. Sometimes I do them just to find out what I feel like doing them. And sometimes I do them because I want to have some exciting things to tell my grandchildren. Is it improper to talk about having grandchildren? I've discovered that it's improper to talk about having children. One evening when people were here, Aunt Laura told me quite kindly, "What are you thinking so earnestly about, Emily?" And I said, "I'm picking names for my children." I meant to have 10. And after the company had gone, Aunt Elizabeth said to Aunt Laura icily, "I think it will be better in the future, Laura, if you do not ask the child what she's thinking of. If Aunt Laura doesn't, I shall be sorry, because when I have an interesting thought, I like to tell it." School begins again next week. Elise is going to ask Miss Brownwell if I can sit with her. I intend to act as if Rhoda was not there at all. Teddy's going too. Dr. Burnley said he's well enough to go through his mother, though his mother doesn't like the idea. Teddy says she never likes to have him go to school, but she's glad that he hates Miss Brownwell. Aunt Laura says the right way to end a letter to a dear friend is yours affectionately. So I am yours, very affectionately, Emily Birdstar. P.S. Because you are my very dearest friend still, Father. Elise says she loves me best of anything in the world in her red leather boots that Miss Sims gave her next. Chapter 13. A Daughter of Eve. New Moon was noted for its apples, and on that first autumn of Emily's life there, both the old and the new orchards bore a bumper crop. In the new were the titled and pedigreed apples, and in the old the seedlings unknown to catalogs, that yet had flavor wildly sweet and all their own. There was no taboo on any apple, and Emily was free to eat all she wanted of each and every kind, the only prohibition being that she must not take any to bed with her. Aunt Elizabeth, very properly, did not want her bed messed up with apple seeds, and Aunt Laura had a horror of anyone eating apples in the dark, lest they might eat an apple worm into the bargain. Emily, therefore, should have been able to fully satisfy her appetite for apples at home, but there's a certain old kink in human nature by reason of which the flavor of the apples belonging to somebody else is always vastly superior to our own. As if the crafty serpent of Eden very well knew, Emily, like most people, possessed this kink, and consequently thought that nowhere were there such delicious apples as those belonging to Lofty John. He was in the habit of keeping a long row of apples on one of the beams of his workshop, and it was understood that she and Elise might help themselves freely whenever they visited that charming, dusty, shaving-carpeted spot. 3 varieties of Lofty John's apples were their especial favorites. The scabby apples that looked as if they had leprosy, but were of unsurpassed deliciousness under their queerly blotched skins. The little red apples, scarcely bigger than a crab, deep crimson all over and glossy as satin, that had such sweet nutty flavor, and the big green sweet apples that children usually thought the best of all. Emily considered that day wasted. Lo, descending sun had not beheld their munching one of Lofty John's big green apples. In the back of her mind, Emily knew quite well that she should not be going to Lofty John's at all. To be sure, she had never been forbidden to go, simply because it had never occurred to her aunts that an intimate of New Moon would so forget the beloved old family feud between the houses of Murray and Sullivan belonging to 2 generations back. It was an inheritance that any proper Murray would live up to as a matter of course. But when Emily was off with that little Ishmaelite of an Elise, traditions lost their power under the allurement of Lofty John's reds and scabs. She wandered rather lonesomely into his workshop one September evening at twilight. She had been alone since she came from school. Her aunts and cousin Jimmy had gone to Shrewsbury, promising to be back by sunset. Elise was away also, her father prodded thereto by Miss Sims, having taken her to Charlottetown to get a winter coat. Emily liked being alone very well at first. She must write her a note and forgive her. Was there time for that? Oh, how cold her hands were. Perhaps that meant she was dying already. She had heard or read that your hands turn cold when you were dying, and she wondered if her face was turning black already. She grasped her candle and hurried up the stairs to the spare room. There was a looking-glass there, the only one in the house that hung low enough for her to see her reflection in. Ordinarily, Emily would have been frightened to death by the mere thought of going into that spare room. But the one great terror had swallowed all the lesser ones. She looked up at her reflection amid the sleek black flow of her hair and the upward striking light of the dark background of the shadowy room. Oh, she was pale as the dead already. Yep, that was a dying face. There could be no doubt of it. Something rose up in Emily and took possession of her, some inheritance from the good old stock behind her. She ceased to tremble. She accepted her fate with bitter regret, but calmly. I don't want to die, but since I have to, all dies becomes a Murray, she said. She had read a similar sentence in a book, and it came pat to the moment. And now she must hurry. That letter to Elise must be written. Emily went to Aunt Elizabeth's rooms first to assure herself that her right-hand top bureau drawer was quite tidy. Then she flitted up the garret stairs to her dormer corner. The great place was full of lurking, pouncing shadows that crowded about the little island of faint candlelight. But they had no terrors for Emily now. And to think I was feeling so bad today because my petticoat was bunchy, she thought. She got out her papers. Dear Elise, wrote Emily, her hands shaking a little, but her lips firmly set. I'm going to die, wrote Emily. I've been poisoned by an apple. Lofty John had put for rats. I will never see you again, but I'm writing this to tell you I love you, and you're not to feel bad because you called me a skunk and a bloodthirsty mink yesterday. I forgive you, so do not worry over it. And I'm sorry I told you that you were beneath contempt, because I didn't mean a word of it. I love you. And I'll leave you my entire share of broken dishes in our playhouse. And please tell Teddy goodbye for me. He will never be able to teach me how to put worms on a fishhook now. I promised him he could. Because I didn't want him to think that I was a coward. But I'm glad I did not, for I know what the worm feels like now. I do not feel sick yet, but I don't know what the symptoms of poisoning are, and Lofty John said there was enough to kill a dozen of me, so I can't have long. If Aunt Elizabeth is willing, you can have my necklace of Venetian beads. It's the only valuable possession I have. Don't let anybody do anything to Lofty John because he did not mean to poison me, and it was all my own fault. Perhaps people will think he did it on purpose because I'm a Protestant, but I feel sure he did not. And please tell him not to be haunted by remorse. I think I feel a pain in my stomach now, so I guess that the end draws nigh. Farewell, and remember her who died so young. Your own devoted friend, Emily. As Emily folded up her letter bill, she heard the sound of wheels in the yard below. A moment later, Elizabeth and Laura Murray were confronted in the kitchen by a tragic-faced little creature. "Emily, what's the matter?" cried Aunt Laura. "I'm dying," said Emily solemnly. "I ate an apple Lofty John had poisoned for rats, and I have only a few moments left to live, Aunt Laura." Laura Murray dropped down on the black bench with her hand in her heart. Elizabeth turned as pale as Emily herself. "Emily, is this some play acting of yours?" "No," cried Emily. "It's the truth. Do you suppose I'm a dying person would be play acting? Aunt Elizabeth, please will you give this letter to Elise, and please forgive me for being naughty. Though I wasn't always naughty when you thought I was, and don't let anyone see me after I'm dead if I turn black. Especially Rhoda Stewart." By this time, Aunt Elizabeth was herself again. "How long ago did you eat the apple, Emily?" "About an hour." "If you'd eaten a poisoned apple an hour ago, you'd be dead or sick by now." "Oh," cried Emily, transformed in a second. A wild, sweet hope sprang up in her heart. Was there a chance for her after all? Then she added despairingly, "But I felt another pain in my stomach just as I came downstairs." "Laura, take this child to the cookhouse and give her a good dose of mustard and water at once. It will do no harm, and it may do some good if there's anything in this yarn of hers. I'm going down to the doctor's. He may be back, but I'll see Lofty John on the way." Aunt Elizabeth went out, and Aunt Elizabeth went out very quickly. If it had been anyone else, it might have been said she ran. As for Emily, well, Aunt Laura gave her that concoction in short order, and 2 minutes later, Emily had no doubt about it that she was dying then and there. And the sooner the better. When Aunt Elizabeth returned, Emily was lying on the sofa in the kitchen, as white as the pillow under her head and as limp as a faded lily. "Wasn't the doctor home?" cried Aunt Laura. "I don't know. There's no need of the doctor. I don't think there was from the first. It's just one of Lofty John's jokes. He thought he'd get Emily a fright just for fun. His idea of fun. March you off to bed, Miss Emily. You deserve all you got for going over to Lofty John's at all, and I don't pity you a particle. I haven't had such a turn for years." "I did have a pain in my stomach," said Emily, in whom fright and mustard and water combined had temporarily extinguished all spirit. "Anyone who eats apples from dawn to dusk must expect a few pains in her stomach. You won't have any more tonight, I reckon. The mustard will remedy that. Take your candle and go." "Well," said Emily, getting unsteadily to her feet, "I hate that dod-gasted Lofty John." "Emily," said both of her aunts together. "He deserves it," said Emily. "Oh, Emily, that dreadful word you used." Aunt Laura seemed curiously upset about something. "Why, what's the matter with dod-gasted?" said Emily, quite mystified. "Cousin Jimmy uses it often when things vex him, and he used it today. He said dod-gasted heifer had broke out of the graveyard pasture again." "Emily," said Aunt Elizabeth, with the air of one impaling herself on the easiest horn of a dilemma, "your cousin Jimmy's a man, and men sometimes use expressions in the heat of anger that are not proper for little girls." "But what's the matter with dod-gasted?" persisted Emily. "It isn't a swear word, is it? And if it is, why can't I use it?" "And if it isn't, why can't I use it?" "It isn't a ladylike word," said Aunt Laura. "Well, then I won't use it any more," said Emily. "But Lofty John is dod-gasted." Aunt Laura laughed so much after Emily had gone upstairs that Aunt Elizabeth told her a woman her age should have more sense. "Elizabeth, you know it was funny," protested Laura. Emily being safely out of sight, Elizabeth permitted herself a somewhat grim smile. "I told Lofty John a few plain truths. He'll not go telling children that they're poisoned again." Worn out, Elizabeth fell asleep as soon as she was in bed, but an hour later she awakened. Aunt Elizabeth had not yet come to bed, so the blind was still up, and Emily saw a dear friendly star winking down at her. Far away, the sea moaned alluringly. Oh, it was nice just to be alone and to be alive. Life tasted good to her again. Tasted like more, as Cousin Jimmy said. She could have a chance to write more letter bills and poetry. Emily already saw a yard of verses entitled Thoughts of One Doomed to Sudden Death. And play with Elise and Teddy, scour the barns with Saucy Sal, watch Aunt Laura's skin cream in the dairy, and help Cousin Jimmy garden, read books in Emily's bower, and trot along the Today Road, but not visit Lofty John's workshop. She determined that she would never have anything to do with Lofty John again after his diabolical cruelty. She felt so indignant with him for frightening her after they had been such good friends, too, that she could not go to sleep until she had composed an account of her death by poison. Of Lofty John being tried for her murder and condemned to death, and of his being hanged on a gibbet, as lofty as himself. Emily being present at the dreadful scene in spite of the fact that she was dead by his act. When she had finally cut him down and buried him with obligity, her tears screaming down her face out of sympathy for Mrs. Lofty John, she forgave him. Very likely he was not dog-gasted after all. She wrote it all down on a letter bill in the garret the very next day. So that's chapters 12 and 13. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you're having a great weekend, and I will see you again real soon. Bye, guys.